Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. No more time to waste. So much to get into. So much to talk about. And the story of the day, the story of the weekend, the story maybe, frankly, of the entire college football season happened in South Bend, Indiana, Saturday night. And no, I'm not talking about the students rushing the field. Good for them, had no problem with it at all. But the story itself was Notre Dame 47, Clemson 40. And in this college football season, it's been kind of crazy, right? Because we were so happy to have college football back, so excited for the season. But if you watch a lot of these quote-unquote big games, they really haven't lived up to the hype, right? Alabama blows out Georgia. Florida blows out Georgia. Georgia blows out Tennessee. Ohio State blows out Penn State. Clemson blows out Miami. And so when we're talking about now into the 10th week of college football in some form or fashion, really outside of that great A&M Florida game, not a ton of super exciting, super fun games to discuss, but Notre Dame Clemson certainly delivers. Just a crazy back and forth game. I know most of you were on the couch glued to your TV, but for people who didn't see it, really just a great battle, right? Like sometimes, I know everyone calls me, oh, you're hot take Torres. You always got to have a big opinion about everything. Sometimes you just get a really good football game between two really good football teams, and you just enjoy the hell out of it. Somebody's got to win. Somebody's got to lose. It doesn't mean that everybody's terrible. It doesn't mean that somebody's got to get fired, all that kind of stuff. And that is what we got on Saturday night with Clemson and Notre Dame. Notre Dame largely dominates early. They're up 23-13 at halftime. Clemson largely got lost in the shuffle a little bit, largely dominated the second half, held Notre Dame to 3 points in the second half until the final drive. Ian Book takes Notre Dame the length of the field. They end up winning in double overtime, and celebration, mayhem in the streets in South Bend. Notre Dame wins, finally gets that signature victory over a marquee opponent. It's incredible. I'm obviously very happy for Notre Dame and their fans. And that's really where we should start. So first of all, I want to say this. I know that the big story coming into the game was no Trevor Lawrence, right? How could it not be? Number one team in the country without their quarterback, not allowed to play. For people who are a little confused, he was already through the protocol of quarantining, but because he had not had that heart test because of myocarditis, he was not allowed to play. That is why he was on the sidelines but not allowed to play. But when you have the number one team in the country going on the road without their number one starting quarterback, who is, of course, the eventual number one draft pick, of course, that is going to be the story of the game. But when I look at the bigger picture of this game, what it means for Notre Dame and what it means for both teams, frankly, I think the story was actually Notre Dame themselves. Because if you watch this game, Notre Dame largely physically dominated this game. Now, could you say, would it have been a different result with Trevor Lawrence? Of course you can say that. You can't argue that Trevor Lawrence, the number one pick in the draft, would have made a difference, but I also don't think that you can argue that him not being there is the reason that they lost. To his credit, the freshman DJ Uiagalelei, I forget how to say his name already. I said it last week perfectly. It was incredible if you missed it. But DJ Uiagalelei, I think is how you say it, 29 of 44, 439 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So don't tell me this was only about Trevor Lawrence when DJ Uiagalelei throws for 439 yards, 2 touchdowns, and is largely phenomenal. Credit to him as a true freshman, going on the road, meeting the challenges of playing in a road venue with fans in the stands. I thought he was phenomenal. Instead, the story to me was not Trevor Lawrence. Instead, it was Notre Dame. It was Notre Dame stepping up to the table. It was Notre Dame being the more physically dominant team and really being the first team that I can remember pretty much in this entire run for Notre Dame that just for Clemson, that just physically dominated Clemson. Listen, Clemson's been in playoff games against Ohio State, against Oklahoma, against Notre Dame a few years ago, against Alabama. And I have never seen anyone physically dominate Clemson the way that Notre Dame did on Saturday night. On the offensive side of the ball for Clemson, they couldn't. The reason DJ Uiagalelei had such a great game was because they couldn't run the ball. Notre Dame physically controlled the trenches. 34 yards total rushing for Clemson on 33 carries. In other words, they couldn't get anything going with one of the best running backs in college football, Travis Etienne. That is a credit to Notre Dame. That is a credit to their physicality. That is proof that they were just as good, if not better, and in this case, they were better than Clemson on this particular night. To take it a step further, the other side of the ball, Ian Book, did you notice that his uniform at the end of the game really wasn't that dirty? I mean, yes, in the second half, Clemson ramped up the defense a little bit. He did take a couple sacks, but that offensive line was phenomenal. You look at the end of this game, 140 yards rushing for Kyron Williams. First play of the game, essentially, he rips off a 70-plus yard touchdown run. Overall, Notre Dame rushes for over 200 yards. And in general, 5 yards per rush for Notre Dame, over 14 yards per completion for Notre Dame through the air. And it was, again, because Ian Book had all this time in the pocket. So please, do not tell me this was about Trevor Lawrence. This was about Notre Dame. We need to give them credit. They deserve to win this game because they were the better program. And now look, in the bigger picture, they now control their own destiny in terms of the college football playoff. There's really only like 2 or 3 teams that really control their own destiny, Ohio State being one, Alabama being another. I think you could make the case that Florida controls its own destiny in the college football playoff. I think Clemson does to a degree too. But for Notre Dame, this was what they've been waiting for. They've been waiting for that signature win. They've been waiting for that meaningful win. They get it, and now the path to the playoff is in front of them. I've spent the last 6 or 7 weeks talking about who's number 4 in college football, and right now it certainly appears to be Notre Dame. If anything, Clemson's number 4 and Notre Dame's number 2 or 3. But if you're Notre Dame, this is what you've been waiting for. You are now atop the ACC standings. You're the only undefeated team. You do have 3 out of your last 4 games on the road at Boston College, at UNC, Syracuse, and at Wake Forest. You win those games, you're going to the ACC championship game, potentially not even needing to win the ACC championship game to go to the playoff, depending on what happens in the Big 12, what happens in the Pac-12, and frankly, what happens in the SEC with a Texas A&M, a Florida, or whatever. So that's the great news if you're Notre Dame. And my only other really thought on Notre Dame, and I do want to take this a step deeper than just the win on Saturday. I just want to say this. I am so happy for Brian Kelly. First of all, I'm so happy for Notre Dame fans. I'm so happy for the alumni. I'm so happy for all people affiliated with Notre Dame football. Listen, I know fans of other fan bases. Oh my goodness, they're so obnoxious. Every fan base has obnoxious fans. But here's why I'm happy for Notre Dame, and more specifically, here's why I'm happy for Brian Kelly. I don't think this guy gets nearly enough credit for what he has done at Notre Dame. Now, admittedly, I am a little biased. I think I've said it on this show before, but Brian Kelly, when he was at Cincinnati, for people who don't remember because he's been at Notre Dame a decade now, he was at Cincinnati before Notre Dame, and when he was at Cincinnati, that was largely when I was at UConn, and it was crazy to see him come in at Cincinnati. Cincinnati had Mark D'Antonio before Brian Kelly gets there. And the second Brian Kelly gets there, the program just takes off. Like, they were good under Mark D'Antonio, and then they went to another level under Brian Kelly. And so since he has been there, since I saw that up close and in person, I said, this dude's a rock star, man. And I remember vividly, I was just out of school starting my career when he got hired at Notre Dame. And I remember even saying back then, when I had no audience, when nobody knew who I was, some would argue people still don't know who I am, but that's okay. Neither here nor there. I remember saying at that, I said, Notre Dame, you just got the guy. You've been waiting for the guy. You thought Charlie Weiss was the guy. You thought Ty Willingham was the guy. This is the guy. And I think Brian Kelly has largely lived up to that. The problem, of course, is we know how social media is. We know how other fans are. And by the way, to be clear, I'm not blaming SEC or Big Ten or Ohio State or Michigan fans, but we know how fans of other fan bases are. And of course, the argument with Notre Dame, oh, they're overrated. They're living in the past. They'd be the ninth best team in the SEC. Like every time we talk about Notre Dame, like we can't just have a conversation about Notre Dame, about them being good, about Brian Kelly being good, without it automatically, well, they're overrated. It's like, well, no, they're not always overrated, right? And I think Brian Kelly doesn't get the credit he deserves because he's never won a national championship, because he's never won those super marquee games. But it comes down to something that I don't think anybody is willing to talk about. Because here's the thing sometimes with the media, right? And this isn't going to be like a whole media thing because the media is in a weird place with the public right now. But I think the media sometimes doesn't give you the whole side of every story. And I think that's one reason why you guys come to this show is because I present you the facts with my opinion, but one, I take it deeper than most people do, and hopefully I make you think differently than other people think. And so when everyone just says, oh, Brian Kelly, Notre Dame, they're overrated, they never win a big game. You can't just compare apples to apples when it comes to that. Because Notre Dame is a completely different job than Ohio State, or than Texas, or than Oklahoma, or than Florida, or Georgia, or USC, or Alabama. And that's not a discredit to any of those jobs, but in a lot of ways, Notre Dame is a way harder job. And I know fans don't want to hear it when Notre Dame loses a big game. Notre Dame fans don't want to hear it. And oh, by the way, Alabama fans and Georgia fans don't want to hear it. But it is a different job with different obligations, with different difficulties that those jobs don't deal with. First of all, have any of you ever been to Notre Dame? I know many of you have. We have a lot of listeners in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. Notre Dame's in the middle of nowhere, okay? It's cold. It's isolated. I've driven through there. And it's kind of almost reminds me of Lincoln, Nebraska, where Nebraska Cornhuskers play. There's not a lot before you get there. There's not a lot when you leave. And I'll be honest, even when you're in town, there's not a lot. And if we have listeners in South Bend, that's no disrespect, but that's the reality. It's not a super metropolitan area like USC. It's not a super metropolitan area like Texas and Austin. It's not a super metropolitan area like Madison, Wisconsin, or Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio, by the way, has professional sports teams. They got a professional hockey team in the NHL, the Columbus Blue Jackets, okay? South Bend isn't even close. So it's a small school in the middle of nowhere. And it is a small school, by the way. I didn't realize just how small it is. I looked it up before I got on air with you guys. 8,700 undergrads at that school. For comparison's sake, Ohio State has like 50,000 or 60,000. Same with Wisconsin, same with Penn State, etc. But I bring all this up to say that it's completely different than recruiting to Georgia. It's completely different than recruiting to Texas or Oklahoma or Florida. You got to get a certain kind of kid. Oh, by the way, academics are really hard. Again, no disrespect to those other schools, but we know there's a lot of schools in this country where college football is king and where kids, if they don't want to go to class or they weren't very good in high school academically, will still figure out a way to get them in. Notre Dame's not that way, man. I know people that have worked there in football. I know people that have worked there in basketball. You have to be really good in school to get into Notre Dame, and you got to be really good in school when you stay there. And again, the campus life is a different experience. I looked this up just to make sure this was correct, but first of all, if you're a freshman through junior, you have to live in campus dorms. This isn't like at Ohio State or Alabama where the second you become a sophomore, you move off campus, you get a house, you take a bunch of online classes, you live your best life. You got to live on campus your freshman and junior year. The dorms are not co-ed. Look this up just to make sure. 31 dorms at Notre Dame. No co-ed dorms. Call me crazy because I was a college kid once. I would have liked living in a non-co-ed dorm. No overnight visitors. No alcohol in any of the dorms, even if you're 21. And so again, I'm not saying that Brian Kelly is coaching at East Tennessee and it's impossible. But what I'm just saying is he has a lot of disadvantages that other schools don't have to deal with. And I've often wondered, if you can win 10, 11 games at Notre Dame in this era, he could win a national championship. Give Brian Kelly the recruiting base. By the way, that's the other thing. It's in the middle of Indiana. You got to recruit from coast to coast. There's no kids in your area, but even more because of the academics, you have such a smaller pool of kids to recruit. So send them to USC, where you can throw a rock and hit 15 Division I high-caliber NFL draft prospects. Send them to Florida. Send them to Florida State. I guarantee you that dude could win national championships there, and he might just win a national championship at Notre Dame. But like this idea that because he's not Alabama, because he's not Clemson, that Notre Dame is always overrated. No. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. I think this guy is doing about as well as anyone could do at Notre Dame. Now, look, if we went in a time machine, we gave Nick Saban the job 10 years ago, maybe it's a different deal. Urban Meyer gets the job, maybe it's a different deal. Those are two of the all-time greats. But in the broader sense, I'm sorry. I know fans want to say Notre Dame's overrated. They never win the big one. Well, one, they won the big one. One, I don't think they could do better than Brian Kelly. Small school, middle of nowhere, no recruiting base, high academics, serious restrictions when you're on campus, no overnight guests in the dorms, no co-ed dorms, no alcohol in the dorms even if you're 21. That doesn't sound like much of a college experience to me. And if I was an 18-year-old kid, I probably wouldn't choose Notre Dame. And I know a lot of you guys are listening like, dude, I had a great time in college. I wouldn't have done that, especially if I'm a football player. So I'm just saying is I hate when we do the whole apples to apples. Well, he's not Nick Saban, can't beat Bama. Well, guess what? You know who else can't beat Bama? Anybody in the SEC. You know who else can't beat Clemson? Anybody in the ACC. I love Brian Kelly, and I give him so much credit for building up this program, and credit to him. They now have pole position to get to the college football playoff. And look, we'll wrap on this topic, but what I would say very simply is we will see what happens once we get to, we will see what happens once we get to the ACC championship game. And it's not to take away from Clemson. We'll talk about Clemson momentarily, but Notre Dame deserved this win. Notre Dame deserved this moment, and credit to Brian Kelly, who has done an incredible job with this program. And as I said, I think he's about as good as Notre Dame could ever expect to do in this current climate and environment.